Wow. Wow. That's incredible. You mentioned something too, before we were talking about that, and it popped right back into my head. Just how God will, like, you put it out there of like, okay, I want this or this. How does it pan itself out? And you make a decision, and then your actions seem to flow forward through that decision. Like you make it happen, right? And you know what I think about too? I read a lot on kind of the psychology of just human dynamics in the mind. And what's so crazy is God is the creator of the mind. Someday, maybe I'll write a book called God Invented Psychology, because I'm not a psychologist by any stretch of the imagination, but understanding human dynamics of how our brains operate and what motivates us, what doesn't. And one of the things, I'm reading a book right now called The Magic of Thinking Big, something I'm reading with my leaders at work. And a lot of it breaks down this thing, the principle of just putting big ideas and big goals out there and then committing yourself to them. And you see it,
Right.
you see it in a different light from a psychological perspective, from like positive thinking and whatnot. Because it's not just like, oh, I'm always telling myself this, this, and this, and then I'm not doing it. But it breaks it down and it says, look, if you set an objective and you do the discernment, you think about it this way, you do the discernment, you set the objective out there, your mind is designed in such a way that it will problem solve you to that end, right? Which is really amazing when you think about it. So you look at all the successful people in life in all wide array of things, whether it's their marriage, whether it's business, whether it's people who seem to have it all together from their faith life, right? They've so set their mind on something, and they've been blessed with the ability to go, like, just how they were created. We're created this way to go problem solve that, versus if we constantly are doubting our identity. Like, you think about it from an identity perspective, if we're constantly saying we're not worth it, we're not loved, we're not, we have this, literally it begets itself because we're making up reasons and excuses and telling ourselves these things over and over. It becomes the narrative and the story that so like moves our life, versus when you recognize your identity as a child of God, for example, and that's the story you live by, your life necessarily falls in that pattern, right? I don't know. I was just thinking about that as you were mentioning that, because it resonates so strongly with just how I personally think God made us and made our minds and made our psychology and human behavior and how we interact with each other.
When you mentioned desire, and that's one of the things that Ignatius teaches not to be afraid of. Mm-hmm. That obviously desire can be a disordered thing. Yeah. Where if we desire the wrong things, that's bad. But God places desire in our heart for good things too. Mm-hmm. And that if you're pointed towards God in what you're desiring, well, that's a good thing. And that's something that you should pursue. And that's part of the discernment process, is figuring out, you know, am I desiring something that's going to lead me closer to God or something farther away? Yeah. And that's one of the other things that's probably big in Ignatian spirituality. They call it his first principle and foundation. Mm-hmm. And it's from the spiritual exercises, where he kind of talks about where you need to orient your life. And it seems very straightforward and very basic that you orient it towards God. Yeah. But actually putting it into practice is a difficult thing to do, to where you're not focused on what you want, but on what God wants. Mm-hmm. And the way that he teaches us to do that is through indifference, actually. So imagine that situation to where, let's say you're put in a situation where it's between two jobs. Yeah. And you said, okay, God, which one do I want? Naturally, you're going to be inclined for this one because maybe it makes more money, or maybe it's a better status, or maybe it's more the dream job that you wanted, right? But really, both jobs are good jobs. And you ask yourself, all right, so I'm going to take this to God and I'm going to discern it. Well, the first part of that discernment is to actually become indifferent and say, I don't care which one of these I get. Mm-hmm. That if you truly want to find God's will and follow the desire where he's leading you, you have to be able to let go. You have to be able to say, even though you're inclined towards one, that you're willing to take whichever path God puts in front of you. And it makes some of that other stuff that you're talking about a little bit easier. Yeah. When you start approaching life, you know, my wife actually makes fun of me sometimes because of the fact that she says I don't get emotional about many things. I just kind of go through life and whatever happens, happens.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the attitude that you take with it. And eventually you start to see that you can find the good in whatever direction God leads you. And so some of those struggles that you have don't turn out to be a bad thing. You can eliminate them and just focus on, hey, well, where's God leading me to next?
Yeah. And it's not a laziness either. It's
Right.
not a, whatever happens, happens, and I'm just going to sit here idle, not doing anything. It's because I've heard of people on that side of the spectrum too. I'll, let go and let God, and then I'm just going to chill over here on the couch waiting for somebody to pay my rent. But it's being willing to walk through the doors, just being more attentive to the ones that are opening. I love that you said that, because it shed so much light into an experience I had on my own, where when I was, for those who have watched my channel, most of them know my story. I grew up Catholic, and then I went to a bunch of non-denominational churches, evangelical churches, for probably about 7 or 8 years. And then I started to notice inconsistencies between faiths. I didn't really know what to make of them at the time, but I was like, I'm just not going to dig into that. I just don't want to deal with it, right? And then I get pregnant with my wife, and I get pregnant with my son, and I'm like, I probably should figure this stuff out. And it wasn't until, and it's clear as day, this is how I tell my story. It wasn't until I literally surrendered to the reality that God, if you exist, then I'm going to uncover that truth. But equally, if you don't exist, I'm going to uncover that truth. And so I had this indifference towards religion altogether. And that was necessary for me to have in my life, so I could necessarily be open to even considering any kind of argumentation on either side of the equation. It was incredible.
Yeah, we have to get out of our own way, right? That if, a lot of times what you're talking about is you're using your mind prior to that. And if you're trying to rationally figure out if God exists by thinking about it, well, then you're going to end up thinking about flying spaghetti monsters and, the whole Richard Dawkins approach. But if you let go of that and you turn to your heart and your soul and you just become indifferent to things, that's where God can finally speak to you a little bit. And you start to recognize him talking to you, and you start to see the movement of God in your life. But as long as you're stuck up here, it's never going to happen.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for checking out this clip from the Practical Theism podcast. If you enjoyed this clip and you want to check out the full episode, you can do so by finding it on our YouTube channel. Definitely consider subscribing and ringing that little bell so you can continue to get updates and notifications when we release new episodes and new clips just like this one. I hope to see you soon.